WWE has had its fair share of wacky gimmicks over the years. This is a company that gave us their mid-90s period of characters like the Goon, Duke the Dumpster Droese, and Dr. Isaac Yankem DDS, after all. But there are far more examples of such a phenomenon to be found outside of that 3 or 4 year period. Yes, we've been seeing this kind of thing for decades, in fact. Hell, there are examples stretching right up until the present day. But just what are the wackiest gimmicks of all time? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with one of the more recent ones, the Fashion Police. Who were the Fashion Police? Well, they were Breezango under a different name. Yes, it was around 2017 that the duo made up of Tyler Breeze and Fandango decided to forego their old moniker and instead come up with a new one which would see them go in an even wackier direction with their characters. Of course, you might be wondering how the gimmicks of male model and ballroom dancer turned wrestler could ever get any wackier. Well, the way they did this was by going full cartoon character. That's right, now instead of just camping it up every time they hit the ring, the Fashion Police would appear in numerous backstage segments as well towards the end of the 2010s, where they'd regularly judge the gear of their fellow performers, usually with a negative reception. And when they weren't doing this, they were also trying to solve various crimes which had taken place in the WWE locker room, such as who threw that pie at Kevin Owens that one time. Obviously then, this made these segments fertile ground for some pretty funny parodies, with the best parodies the pair did at this point probably being either their Law & Order takeoff or their excellent tribute to David Lynch's masterpiece, Twin Peaks. So funny were they, in fact, they'd be a team all the way until 2021. One other flamboyant, wacky gimmick we won't be seeing in WWE again in the immediate future, however, belongs to our next subject, as they've since jumped over to AEW. That's right, it's time for us to talk about the Maximum Male Models. Yes, well, this one could have been a disaster. In the end, the way the two performers involved committed to it turned into one of the funniest things going at the time. But who were the Maximum Male Models exactly? Well, they were exactly what they sounded like, two male models. And the reason they were first introduced back in April of 2022 was because this was when LA Knight was called up to the main roster and repackaged as Max Dupree, the pair's talented agent and manager. As you all know now, though, Knight's role in Maximum Male Models wouldn't last for long. No, once Triple H took over control of the book later that year, he'd return to his previous gimmick and would get a run as something of a cult sensation babyface. As for Massey and Mansois, well, they'd rebound by letting Max's kayfabe sister Maxine Dupree take over control of their day-to-day operations, with this remaining the case for them pretty much all the way up until they were released from their contracts in December of 2023. This wouldn't be the last we'd see of the models though, as once they became free agents, AEW would sign them. And that's where they remain today under the same gimmick but a different name of MXM Collection. Sure, they might not be top contenders for any titles or anything, and they're hardly likely to be presented as serious contenders to someone like the Hurt Syndicate at any time soon. But that's not what their gimmick's designed for. Rather, it's designed to be a bit of lower card fun, which makes them a perfect act for places such as Ring of Honor and Collision. That said, we can't entirely rule out the possibility that some kind of gold will be in MXM Collection's future, whether that be in ROH or even after a return to WWE somewhere down the line. Hell, for something that should have had a relatively short shelf life, they've managed to remain over for a lot longer than most could ever have expected on account of just how funny they can be. So don't count them out just yet, as there's still plenty to look forward to in their future, just as there's plenty to look forward to yet for our next subject, William Regal. Now, you might be wondering why we're talking about William Regal in the context of wacky gimmicks here, because for the majority of his career, he was portrayed as a pretty traditional technical wrestler. And even in his modern incarnation as backstage agent for the NXT brand, he's not exactly played for laughs. Rather, he's an altogether serious figure. Hell, back during his brief run in AEW when he was the manager of the Blackpool Combat Club, he was a straight-laced figure there too. That said, one time when this has not been true for him was back in the late 90s. What happened then? Well, this was the period where, following a run with WCW, the Staffordshire native was brought into WWF in 1998, right as that company was in the midst of its Attitude Era. Yes, rather than have William come in and be a tough-as-nails, catch-as-catch-can wrestler, he'd be given the gimmick of the real man's man. And that meant his character now involved him wearing things like flannel and hard hats, all while he was carrying out tasks such as chopping wood and drinking orange juice. However, this one wouldn't last long as the gimmick would be dropped when Regal got released from the company. Thankfully though, he'd return to WWF a year or so later to start his spell as on-screen commissioner. But what of another great Attitude Era star, someone who also carved out a nice role for himself in the mid-card with his own wacky gimmick? That's right, it's time to talk about Al Snow. Of course, this one didn't start out life in WWF. Rather, the story begins in Philadelphia. That was where Al Snow was sent to work for Paul Heyman's Extreme Championship Wrestling in 1997 after a couple of failed runs in the WWF as characters like Leif Cassidy and Avatar. That said, while to some this might have been seen as a downgrade, for the Ohio native it turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to him, as it was while working in ECW that he'd develop an all-new gimmick, that of a man who'd had a breakdown and had taken to talking to a mannequin's head. And this got him massively over with the Philly crowd, so much so that his entrance down to the ring amidst a sea of fans waving around their own foam mannequin heads was often one of the best parts of any ECW show. Alas though, for as over as he was there, this was never destined to be a long-term run, as once Vince McMahon saw what Al was doing, he called him back over to WWF in 1998 and there had him start doing his new act for that audience. How would Al Snow as this madman fare in the WWF? Pretty well. Because, as we mentioned a moment ago, he'd become a pretty key part of the mid-card scene during the turn of the millennium period. No, he'd never be winning world titles or anything, but he was a regular in places like the hardcore division. And he also got to lead his own stable for a while, a stable known as the Job Squad. Hell, so over would Al get here, he'd be able to remain a star all the way up until the modern day. And that's allowed him to take on recent endeavors like being the owner and booker of Ohio Valley Wrestling, something which can be seen on the Netflix documentary The Wrestlers. Yes, all in all, things worked out great for Al Snow, and that can be attributed to the fact that he managed to get so over with such a wacky gimmick right at a point when wrestling was at the hottest it's ever been. Really, it's quite an achievement, as in any other era, a crazy guy who talks to a mannequin head might never have reached the same levels of success. But then, the Attitude Era was certainly a special time for wacky gimmicks. In fact, it also gave us our next great example of this in the stable which was known as the Oddities. That's right, one of the most truly bizarre groups ever to exist in wrestling, the Oddities were basically what would happen if a Dust Bowl Carnival freak show was brought onto Raw during the late 90s. Seriously, it was as weird as it sounds. And all the more weird for the fact that their roster was made up of two giants in Giant Silva and Kurrgan, a masked South Park fanatic in Golga, a crazy woman in Luna Vachon, a megalomaniac manager in the Jackal, and the insane Clown Posse. That's right, back in 1998 and 1999, the ICP managed to make it to a WWF ring as part of the wackiest group going on during a period filled with wacky gimmicks. And whenever the Oddities took part in tag team action, they'd usually let Golga do most of the work on the men's side of the equation. But then that worked out just fine because the man under that mask was none other than John Tenta, the man who'd formerly gone by the name of Earthquake. However, by the time 1999 came around, their run would be over, with them all going their own separate ways and doing their own separate things here, such as, in the case of Kurrgan, becoming an actor, and in the case of the Jackal, morphing into AEW's current resident heel manager supreme, Don Callis. But no matter how much success any of the men or women involved would go on to have after the fact, there has to be a place in their heart for the Oddities even to this day, as it was all just so much fun. Seriously, sometimes wrestling can just be good-hearted goofiness like this. And the Oddities were one of the best examples of pure good-hearted goofiness that the Attitude Era ever gave us. But let's move away from the Attitude Era for a moment and onto a time a little bit further back than this, as it's there we find our next subject, a man who certainly had an explosive, if wacky, gimmick. Who are we talking about here? Why, Atom Bomb, of course. Yes, Atom Bomb, or A-Bomb, like the atomic bomb. It was all very silly and very wacky, but as we mentioned earlier, back in mid-90s WWF, this was exactly what Vince McMahon was going for. So when someone presumably came to him and asked why they hadn't capitalized on the atomic bomb furor of the 1950s yet in 1993, he got to thinking and came up with an all-time great wacky character. Enter Brian Clark then, the man who would play this role. Sure, this might have been a difficult character to get over seriously, with him playing a guy who was a survivor of the 3 Mile Island nuclear meltdown and had now been gifted with radioactive enhancement as a result. But Clark was able to pull it off for a few years as he remained a solid presence on WWF TV throughout a large portion of the New Generation era. No, he never got a chance to challenge for the world title or anything, but he filled a role as a great heel mid-card act. Hell, this would even be enough to see him get on the card of WrestleMania 10 when he there challenged Earthquake. And while the heel would lose this match in just 35 seconds, he remained on WWF TV all the way up until August of 1995, at which point his Radioactive Man gimmick ended and he instead moved over to WCW to take on the role of Wrath as part of the equally as wacky Blood Runs Cold angle that company were doing at the time. But this would be far from the only wacky thing that promotion was involved in over the years. And we're not even talking about things like Oz, the Shockmaster, or the Kiss Demon here. Instead, we're talking about a gimmick so infamous it couldn't not be included today, the group that was known to the world as the Dungeon of Doom. Yes, it was back in March of 1994 that after signing with WCW, Hulk Hogan found an enemy in a new heel stable made up of The Butcher, Avalanche, and Kevin Sullivan. Back during those initial days, though, the trio weren't known as the Dungeon of Doom quite yet. No, they were known as the Three Faces of Fear instead. But once Sullivan met with the mysterious Master, this all changed, and the group morphed into their more well-known incarnation. Yes, it was all a complete cartoon in the silliest and wackiest possible way, but then what else would you expect from a pre-NWO Hulk Hogan? After all, this was his attempt to relive the 80s by playing all the old hits in a new company. And that's why, as the Butcher and Avalanche morphed into the Zodiac and the Shark respectively, the Dungeon of Doom would add even more old faces from Hulkamania's past to its ranks when performers such as Kamala, Meng, and Vader all joined in on the fun too. But none of these would be the secret weapon in Kevin Sullivan's arsenal. No, his secret weapon would be the Giant, someone who at that point was being billed as the long-lost son of Andre the Giant. And then of course there was the infamous Yeti. But the less said about that one, the better. No, it's probably best to focus on the truly bizarre segments the Dungeon of Doom gave us, with the most notable one to this day probably still being the time Hogan was transported into the Master's evil realm, only to dip his hand in some water and exclaim loudly in shock, "It's not hot!" And this only helped to add to the wackiness of the whole thing. Wackiness which would continue all the way up until 1996 and beyond. That's right, even after the Hulkster turned heel and formed the New World Order in the summer of that year, the Dungeon of Doom continued to hang around for a while yet. Sure, they wouldn't really have much of a purpose anymore now that Hulkamania had been destroyed, but they would continue to operate in undercard action for the most part, all the way up until 1998 nevertheless. Really though, this was a gimmick which could have only thrived during the odd time that was early 90s WCW. Of course, for fans of camp though, this is exactly why they loved it then and continue to love it today. But it's not like we haven't still had some pretty silly gimmicks in recent years too. You only have to look to the time where, in the not too distant past of mid-2010s WWE, we've seen the wacky tag team known as Los Matadores. Who were Los Matadores? Well, they were the duo made up of Primo and Epico, or to be more specific, the Colon brothers, children of Carlos Colon and brother to Carlito. But while Carlito had somewhat of a wacky gimmick of his own with his apple-chewing desire to stop everyone who wasn't cool, that was nothing compared to what Primo and Epico were tasked with getting over in 2013. That's right, the pair would play matadors, and as you would expect, whenever any great matador is around, a bull must be somewhere near. So this was why fans would be introduced to another new character not long after this, a manager / third member of the group in El Torito, or the Little Bull in English. Needless to say then, this truly was wacky, and it gave us one of the greatest comedy matches ever put out in front of a live audience. What match are we talking about here? Why, WLC of course, the pre-show bout from Extreme Rules 2014 which pitted El Torito against fellow little person Hornswoggle. Still though, it would not be enough to see them hang around for much longer after that, at least not in the same incarnation. And we can say that safely because it was in April of 2015 that the pair would be rebranded into a new gimmick, the Shining Stars. Of course, Los Matadores and their third, El Torito, wouldn't be the only wacky gimmick mid-2010s WWE gave us. No, there were plenty of other ones Vince McMahon created around this time. And one of the most notable of these would be our next subject, in fact, the man who now goes by the name of Tyrus, but who then went by the name of the Funkasaurus. Yes, it was the dreaded big guy gets a dancing gimmick, a gimmick which has spelled the end for so many performers in the past. But while this one didn't exactly lead to WrestleMania main events for Brodus Clay, it did at least keep him relevant in WWE for a little while longer. How did it all start? Well, it was in late 2011 that after his early main roster run of bodyguard to Alberto Del Rio turned out to be a bit of a flop, vignettes began airing on TV announcing the soon-to-come debut of an all-new superstar. Obviously then, what was being advertised here was Clay's new repackaged gimmick, the Funkasaurus. And it wouldn't be long after this that we'd finally get to see the Funkasaurus make his debut on TV by looking like someone who'd stepped right out of a concert in the 1970s. Well, we say stepped, but what we really mean is strutted, because whenever he'd arrive at the ringside area for a match, the Funkasaurus would take great care to dance his way down to the ring. Not that he'd be doing this alone, though. No, he'd always have his Funkadactyls by his side, two women who were more than happy to lend him a helping hand busting a move. And then there was the period that Lord Tensai even joined his crew, as the two became known as Tons of Funk for a while. Would this lead to much in the way of title success for the future NWA World's Champion? No. Tons of Funk couldn't cut the mustard in that respect. But at least the big man would win a Slammy Award for Best Dancer in 2012. And of course, once the Funk foursome of Brodus, Tensai, and the Funkadactyls went their own separate ways in 2014, at least two of their members would go on to greater success, because when it came to the leader, the Funkasaurus, as we mentioned a moment ago, he'd eventually join the National Wrestling Alliance and win their world title. And as for one of the Funkadactyls, well, Naomi would go on to become a two-time WWE Women's Tag Team Champion and two-time SmackDown Women's Champion. So there was a lot of good that came out of this wacky gimmick then. Hell, there was a lot more good that came out of this one than came out of our next entry, the time Conor O'Brien turned into a rat. Don't remember this one? That's probably for the best, because it was truly bizarre, but not bizarre enough that we're not going to remind you of it here. It also started all the way back in 2011, as that was when, before he was a member of the Ascension alongside his tag team partner Victor, Conor O'Brien was struggling to get over as a solo act on the NXT brand. Needless to say then, in an attempt to figure out who he was as a performer, the Grand Rapids native experimented with a lot of different gimmicks here, and none of those gimmicks were more odd than that of the Rat Man. What was the idea here? Well, it appeared to be that Conor was transforming into some kind of human-rat hybrid, as over a series of weeks, he'd start developing more rat-like tendencies, such as sniffing around a lot and being obsessed with following trails of cheese. Yeah, this was as insane as it sounds. Hell, even for the world of wrestling, it was wacky. Had Conor been involved in some kind of David Cronenberg Fly-style situation where he'd merged with a rat and a teleportation machine? Maybe? We certainly don't have any better explanation for what was going on, and we'd never get one either, because pretty soon after this Ratman character was introduced, it would be dropped as Conor O'Brien instead became Conor with a K, the tag team partner to Victor, and one half of the 80s throwback team, the Ascension. But while it's the Ascension Conor is best known for today, we can't help but feel a little nostalgic for that brief period he started turning into a rat, as it was just so weird, so wacky, it hits that sweet spot of being so bad it's good perfectly. It's just a shame then that once Conor O'Brien left WWE in 2019, he wouldn't revive this old gimmick in other places he worked like TNA. No, there he'd play the role of Big Con instead, something a lot closer to his Ascension character. Yes, the wrestling world has always loved wacky gimmicks. After all, they're part of what makes the industry so much fun, as every example we've looked at today has shown us.